This is the Architect Exam Podcast, the official podcast of the Young Architect Academy.
Welcome to the Architect Exam Podcast. I'm Layla, and I'm here with Michael Rasica.
Hey, guys.
And today we're diving into something that honestly changed everything for me when I was taking my ARE exams. If you've ever walked out of an exam thinking, oh man, I knew that material, this episode is specifically for you. Because today, we're breaking down exactly how to beat the ARE, even when you know the content, but still trip up on questions themselves.
You know, Layla, I've seen this so many times. People who studied very hard know the content and can recite the building codes in their sleep, but they're still failing exams because they're misunderstanding what the question is actually asking them.
Exactly. And that was me too. I remember sitting in exams feeling like I was playing some kind of guessing game instead of demonstrating I actually knew about architecture. So today, we're going to give you the tools to read ARE questions strategically and answer them with confidence. By the end of this episode, you're going to understand how you can strip away all the noise in complex questions, identify keywords that change everything, and eliminate wrong answers even when you're not 100% sure.
But here's what's really cool about this. It's these same skills translate into practice. When you're interpreting building codes for project or communicating with clients about complex issues, you're using the same analytical thinking we teach our bootcamp students about how to read questions.
Before we dive into these techniques, though, I want to share how we actually discovered all of this. These aren't just theories. I learned them the hard way by getting a ton of practice questions wrong and then figuring out how to rewrite my approach so I didn't keep making the same mistakes. And I learned all of this in the ARE bootcamp. I'm incredibly passionate about the bootcamp because it literally changed my path to licensure. It felt like before the bootcamp, I was spinning my wheels, retaking exams, and honestly not making real progress. I had study materials, I was putting in the hours, but something was just not clicking.
And that's exactly what I've seen with thousands of our members since I started the bootcamp coaching program back in 2015. And when I say coaching, I don't mean just handing someone study materials. It's talking with people, listening to their specific struggles, helping them identify what's working and what isn't. And I always say there's way too much ARE prep materials, and all of it's doing the same thing. It's talking at you. And that's what makes bootcamp so different from everything else. Instead, we talk with you to make sure you're actually learning it, which is why the bootcamp is a coaching program.
Also, the bootcamp gave me a clear step-by-step path from where I was actually to passing my exams. It's not just about content. It's this whole holistic approach to how you study, how you think, and how you approach these questions.
Because, Layla, what we've learned after all these years, if it was just about having good study materials, everyone would have their architecture license by now. But there's actually so much more to this process, and that's where the coaching becomes crucial.
That's where all these questions analysis techniques come from. Real conversations with real candidates about where they were getting stuck. Now, let's talk about what's really happening in your brain when you sit down for an exam and why the smartest ARE candidates can freeze up on questions they should really know.
You're listening to the Architect Exam Podcast, your guide to passing the ARE.
Hey guys, I hope you're enjoying this podcast about answering ARE questions. And since I know you're at the gym right now, Layla and I created a beautiful 2-page study guide for you so you don't have to take notes. And just visit youngarchitect.com/ARE questions and fill out the form, and we'll email you the notes from this podcast.
The first thing I need to address is what we call exam mindset. When you're under pressure, your brain literally processes information differently. Anxiety can make you second guess things you normally know without even thinking about. I'll never forget this moment during my first attempt at the programming and analysis exam. I was staring at a question about code requirements, something I'd really studied extensively, something I used in my daily work, and I just drew a complete blank. I knew the answer, but the pressure made me overthink every single word in that question.
This is so common in a lot of people. I see a lot of candidates who are brilliant and know the content, but when they get into that testing center, they start overthinking everything. The key insight I've always shared is that confidence and performance are directly connected to each other. After taking boot camp, one of our students went from failing 2 exams before the program to passing the next 3 in a row after learning how to build confidence before test day. When you trust your preparation and your process, your brain can actually access what you know.
That's exactly right. What I learned in boot camp is that there are 3 critical mindset shifts that completely change how you perform. First, you need to start treating questions like puzzles rather than threats. When you see a scenario question and it's complex, instead of panicking, get curious about what they're really testing. Second, remember that you don't need perfect knowledge to pass. The ARE isn't testing whether you memorized every single detail. It's testing whether you can think like an architect and make good decisions. And then third, build your confidence through strategic practice, like timing yourself on practice questions so that you learn to stay calm under pressure. The more you practice reading questions this way, the more natural this becomes on the exam.
And don't forget the basics. Just get good sleep before your exam, eat a good meal. I've had people tell me they showed up running on coffee and adrenaline, and that's just setting yourself up to fail when it comes to focusing. And trust me, I've even made that mistake.
So true. Your physical state absolutely affects how well your brain can process complex information. Now, let's get into the mechanics of how ARE questions are actually built, because once you understand the structure, everything becomes so much more clear. Now, let's dissect how ARE questions are actually structured, because there's a pattern here that once you see it, you can't unsee it. Most ARE questions follow this format. They give you a scenario, then some context, and then the actual question. Now, the critical thing to understand here is that what's actually being asked is usually the last sentence. Everything else might be important, but the final question is what you need to focus on. But here's what trips up so many candidates. NCARB loves to add details that sound important but aren't really needed to answer the question. For example, they'll tell you that the building has 3 curved facades when the question is actually really asking you about contract responsibilities. I call this stripping away the noise, and it's probably the most powerful technique I learned in the boot camp.
This is huge. When I'm working with candidates who keep getting stuck, 9 times out of 10, they're focusing on the wrong details. They're trying to process every single piece of information instead of identifying what's actually relevant to the question being asked.
Exactly. There are 3 main types of distracting information you'll see. First, you have contextual fluff. So there's background information that makes the scenario feel realistic, but it doesn't really help solve the problem. Second, you have irrelevant specifications, technical details that might sound important, but they don't really relate to what's being tested. And then third, distracting scenarios. So you have situations that pull your focus away from the core issue in that question. So let me give you an example here of what this looks like in practice. You might see a question that describes this very elaborate scenario about a 3-story commercial building with a complex curved facade. It mentions that the project is 3 weeks behind schedule due to soil conditions. It talks about how concerned the client is about the timeline. But then the actual question is asking about how to handle a discrepancy between structural and architectural drawings.
Exactly. And when you strip away the noise and mentally ignore the irrelevant details like the complex curved facade and the 3 weeks behind schedule, suddenly the question starts to get a lot more clearer. You're just being asked about proper protocol for handling drawing discrepancies. I also call this identifying the keywords. These are the words you can't ignore if you want to get the right answer. These are the words, terms, or phrases that if they didn't exist, you couldn't find the correct answers.
That's such a good point about mentally crossing out the noise and focusing on keywords. So in the office, I always underlined the actual question, highlighted key terms, you cross out the fluff, and then it becomes such an automatic process after a while. The key question to always ask yourself is, what is the actual question here? What is this question asking me? And once you identify that, everything else becomes so much more manageable.
And here's what I love about this approach. It's exactly how you'd handle a complex situation in real life. When the contractor calls with multiple concerns, you learn to identify what needs immediate attention versus what's just context.
Perfect. Now, let's talk a little bit more about the specific keywords that completely change the meaning of a question, because missing or ignoring one keyword can really turn a right answer into a wrong one. Let me tell you about one of my biggest mistakes. I was taking the programming and analysis exam, and I completely missed the word least in a question. So I picked what I thought was the right answer based on just my knowledge, which was exactly the opposite because I had missed that one crucial word. The 5 words that you must know for the exam is most, least, first, best, and primary. Each one is testing something slightly different. So when you see most, they're really asking you to compare multiple correct options and find the best one. It's not that the other answers are actually wrong, it's just that the one is more right. Then when you have least, that is looking for exception. Let's say worst option among choices that all seem reasonable. And then we have first. So what first is testing your knowledge on is the process and sequence. So what should happen before anything else? Then when you see best, means you're evaluating against multiple criteria to find the optimal solution. And lastly, keyword primary. That one is asking you to distinguish between main concerns and secondary concerns.
Guys, NCARB isn't just testing whether you know facts. They want to see judgment under ambiguity. They want to see that you can prioritize and make decisions like a practicing architect would. Sometimes the best option really means the best out of a bunch of bad options. So don't overthink it. All the options might be terrible, and it's your job to pick the best option of all those terrible options.
That's such an important way to think about it. These qualifier words are testing your professional judgment and not just your memory. I always tell people to focus on these keywords when they see them and at least just pause and make sure you've really processed what they're looking for.
I know, right? So if you swap out the qualifier word, the same question might have a completely different correct answer. And that's how powerful these keywords are.
Absolutely. The same question asking for the first thing you'd do versus the most important thing you'd consider could have a totally different answer. And now let's talk about what to do when you've read the question carefully, but you're still not 100% sure about your answer. This is where strategic elimination becomes your best friend. So even when you're unsure about the correct answer, you can often eliminate your way to success. So this was honestly a game changer for me, especially on those questions where I felt like I was stuck between maybe 2 good options. The technique I learned in the boot camp meetups is pattern recognition. So first, you're going to group similar answers together. Look for pairs or outliers in the answer choices. For example, if you have 3 answers that talk about structural safety and one talks about aesthetics, ask yourself what the question is really testing and asking. Now, let's say you see 3 answers that share similar approaches and one that's completely different. Pay attention to that outlier in the question. It might be correct, or it might actually be the distractor in the answers, but it's definitely worth examining more closely. So if you have 2 pairs of answers with contradicting approaches, focus on determining which general approach is correct first. Then you can choose between 2 options within that approach.
Yeah, we worked with someone in the bootcamp who just kept second guessing themselves on their project management questions. So what we actually did was we developed a system where they would first eliminate, they'd focus on the obviously wrong answers before even considering what was a right answer. And their score actually, it made a huge difference for them by just to kind of break that pattern and to let's just nail down why this is wrong as a starting point rather than why is it correct.
That's such a great example of how powerful this technique really is. So the other thing to watch for is just subtle flaws in almost correct answers. So these distractors really are often, they sound right, but they have small errors in them. Watch out for answers with words that have always, or if you see the word never. For example, if a choice says, hey, the architect should approve substitutions, that's a red flag. Real life architecture rarely works in absolutes. Now, sometimes you might see answers that reference the right concept, but it applies it in the wrong context, or they give you the right approach, but at the wrong timing in the process.
So one of the things I see a lot is also people getting tricked by answers that sound more sophisticated or technical, when actually the straightforward answer is the one that's correct. So don't overthink it.
Exactly. When you're down to two answers that both seem reasonable, look for that one that's more precise and comprehensive. So often the correct answer will be more specific about the actual issue being tested.
You're listening to the Architect Exam Podcast, the official podcast of the Young Architect Academy.
Hey guys, if you're looking for more practice questions for your architect exam, check out the Young Architect Academy. We've been writing hundreds of practice questions and we break them down into beginner, intermediate, and hard levels. Because we know when you're at the beginning of studying and everything's brand new, having some really hardcore, difficult questions doesn't always help you. So if you're looking for more practice questions, check out academy.youngarchitect.com.
Now, all of these techniques really only work if you have enough time to apply them. So let's talk a little bit about how you can manage your time. The management and question analysis, really, they go hand in hand. So because if you spend too much time on difficult questions early on in an exam, you're not going to have time to apply other techniques where they really matter. So the strategy that completely changed my approach is what we call the flag and return method in boot camp. And let me tell you how it works. So you want to set a strict limit per question. So you don't want to have more than 2 minutes maximum for any single question on your first pass through the exam. If a question is going to take longer than that, you want to immediately flag it and move on. Don't even try to solve it yet. So flag and move. And then complete all questions that you're confident about first. So this is going to build momentum. It's going to give you confidence as well. And it's going to make sure that you get all these easy points because you want to remember that each question, no matter what its complexity is worth 1 point. Then once you've done that, you can return to your flag questions with whatever time remains. And then when the pressure is lower, now that you've answered most of the ones that you're confident about, you can start thinking more clearly about these remaining questions.
And this approach works across all area divisions, but the time traps are kind of different within each one. And, PPD, PDD people often get stuck on these complex calculations. In project management or the pro practice exams, they overthink these scenario questions, but flagging and returning method works pretty well on all of them.
Yeah, and I really, Mike, learned this the hard way. On my construction and evaluation exam, I spent way too long on the complex questions early on, and then I started rushing my way through the remaining questions, and then the last 10 questions, I definitely missed some easy points there that I just didn't have time to get to. The other piece of this is really having a hierarchy for your educated guesses when time is running out. So if you've eliminated some answers, make sure that you are giving it your best guess for what's left. If you haven't had time to eliminate anything, at least pick an answer rather than just leaving it blank, because you're going to lose that point automatically if you don't answer that question.
Yeah, in bootcamp meetups, we practice this timing pretty extensively. A lot of times someone will have a bunch of questions that they're going to work on, and we'll just show people, in the meetup, we'll share screen and give them the question, but not the answers. And we set a timer, and you have a minute and a half to pick an answer. And then we go back and talk about all those questions we just went over. So yeah, we've done that quite a bit. And people are always surprised how much better they perform when they're not constantly checking the clock and panicking about time.
Yep, exactly. And when you know you have a system for managing time, you can really start focusing all your mental energy on actually answering the questions instead of just worrying about whether you're going to have time to finish it or not. Let me show you how all of these techniques really come together by walking you through a realistic example question. I know you can't see the question since this is a podcast, but stick with me here. I'm going to walk you through the question and my thought process, and then you can follow along. I'm going to also add this question into a 2-page study note you can download at youngarchitect.com/ARE questions. So let's dive in. Here's the question. A project architect is reviewing shop drawings for a curtain wall system on a 15-story office building located in a coastal high wind zone. The manufacturer has submitted details showing structural attachments, gaskets, and water management systems. The client has expressed concerns about energy efficiency. What should be the architect's primary focus when reviewing these shop drawings? So let me read this again for those that are following on the podcast. A project architect is reviewing shop drawings for a curtain wall system on a 15-story office building located in a coastal high wind zone. The manufacturer submitted details showing structural attachments, gaskets, and water management systems. The client expressed concerns about energy efficiency. What should be the architect's primary focus when reviewing these shop drawings? So I'm going to give you 4 answer options. Is it going to be A, confirming the thermal break details meet energy code requirements? B, verifying water management details to prevent moisture infiltration? Or is it going to be C, ensuring structural connections meet wind load requirements? Or lastly, D, is it going to be checking that gasket materials are compatible with adjacent materials? So here's how we're going to approach this. First, I read the full question and identify what's actually being asked. The question is asking about the primary focus when reviewing curtain wall shop drawings. And then we're going to focus on that keyword that we saw, primary, because that's really crucial. They want me to prioritize among valid concerns. Then what I do is just highlight all the key contextual factors. Like we have coastal high wind zone. That's not just descriptive fluff. That's telling me something really important in the question about what should be prioritized.
And that's a good catch on the high wind zone. That's exactly the kind of detail that separates the right answer from the almost right answers. We always teach people to ask themselves, what's the life safety issue here?
Exactly. And now after that, I'm going to cross out the noise. So I have the noise I'm seeing is 15-story office building. So the height doesn't really change any of my analysis here. The client expressed concerns about energy efficiency, and that's a client preference, not a code or any safety concern requirement. So looking at the answers, I can see that the options A, confirming the thermal break details, B, verifying water management details, and D, checking that gasket materials are compatible, they're all valid to check in shop drawings. But if you think about coastal high wind zone, structural connections directly relate to life safety and building integrity.
This is the perfect example of how ARE tests professional judgment. Layla, when you read that question, all the answers sounded correct to me, but all 4 options are things that the architect should review. But C, about the structural connections, really addresses the most critical issue given the specific context.
Exactly. And while energy efficiency is a client concern and water management is always important, structural connections in high wind zones are about really preventing catastrophic failure in a building.
Let's try a quick mental exercise. If we change the word primary to the least important, suddenly A might be the most correct. since energy efficiency, while important, isn't a life safety issue in the same way structural integrity is.
Mike, that's such a perfect example of how one word changes everything. This is why in boot camp we spend so much time drilling these qualifier words. Now, let me share with you some advanced tactics for special question types you're going to encounter. Some special question types that are going to require unique approaches, and knowing these can really give you an extra edge on exam day. So for case study questions, you want to remember that the answer to one question sometimes is going to give you some clues to another. And I always review all the questions in a case study section before starting to answer any of them. So when you see all of the above, or if you see none of the above options, you really want to verify each individual choice. For all of the above to be correct, every single option must be right. For none of the above, every option has some flaw. And for calculation questions, you really want to decide quickly if you need precision or if it's just an estimate. Like if they ask you about a roof slope, for example, and two answers are obviously way too steep, you can just cross those off right away without having to do the math. Now, don't spend 10 minutes calculating exact numbers if rough math gets you to the right choice. Another technique, I answer in my head first before looking at the options. That way, I'm not swayed by any fancy sounding wrong answer. And this is going to really prevent me from being swayed by attractive wrong answers.
And here's another verification trick. After you select an answer, quickly reverse engineer and ask yourself, if this answer is correct, does it make sense with everything I know about this topic? Sometimes that catches mistakes as well.
That's such a great tip. And also you want to watch out for answer options that contain the same keywords as a question. So that's often a signal that they're testing your understanding of that specific concept. Now, let's wrap everything up by reviewing what we've covered and giving you a clear action plan. So the key strategies that can transform your ARE performance. First, you want to really strip away the noise, identify the core question that's being asked of you. Don't get distracted by any elaborate scenarios. You really want to focus on what they actually want you to know. And then second, really be very careful with qualifier words that we just talked about. So like most, least, first, best, and primary. So these words can really change everything about how you're going to approach a specific question. Third, you want to use strategic elimination where you're not sure about the answer. So you want to start looking for patterns, identify maybe flaws that you see in wrong answers, and really trust the process even when you don't feel 100% confident. And then fourth, you really want to manage your time with the flag and return method. You don't want to be held up or stuck on really difficult questions early on. And you're going to start losing momentum with the questions that you actually know. And lastly, what you want to do is practice these techniques regularly so they become automatic under pressure.
Yeah, and let me leave you with my top 3 tips. And I want to keep this simple. First, I'd say study hard. Proper preparation will bring confidence and relieve anxiety when you know the concepts inside and out, backwards and forwards. Make sure that you're studying NCARB's objectives, not studying someone else's summary of what they think NCARB's objectives are. I always say if you're not studying NCARB's objectives, you're not studying for the architect exam. Second tip I'd say is focus on what the question's really asking. NCARB's favorite trick in the book is to bury the real issue with distracting details. So you have to train yourself to spot that. They're going to tell you stories. They're going to throw numbers at you. They're going to give you lots and lots of data. They're going to try to send you down a path you don't need to go down. And at the very end, they're going to say, what's 2 plus 2? And the answer's 4. And all that data and information means absolutely nothing. All right. And my last tip is to remember that passing the ARE, it doesn't require perfection or perfect memorization. It actually requires hard work, persistence, and problem solving. I've seen so many brilliant people fail their exams because they just overthought everything, or they get anxiety because they haven't memorized all this stuff when they know the answer. They just need to work through it. And so focus on solving the problems to get you to the right answers.
So these skills absolutely build with practice. The more you're going to apply these techniques during your study sessions and practice questions, the more natural this is going to become when you're actually taking the exam.
So if you want to dive deeper into these strategies, we go over all this stuff extensively in boot camp. Plus, we give you tons of practice questions to drill on these techniques. You can find all our practice questions and other resources at the Young Architect Academy, academy.youngarchitect.com.
Yeah, and I also want you to remember that the ARE isn't just testing what you actually know, it's testing how you think under pressure. So master these question analysis skills, and you'll walk into that testing center with a lot of confidence. Thanks so much for listening to the Architect Exam podcast. Now, remember, practice reading those questions strategically, and sometimes how you read the question is just as important as what you know. And we'll see you next time.
Have a good day, everyone.
Thanks for listening to the Architect Exam podcast. Ready to take your studying to the next level? Visit our online ARE Architecture School website at academy.youngarchitect.com to learn more about how we can help you. See you next time.